Hello everyone. In today's session, I will be speaking about the business process of e-invoicing, its relevance and also the way forward. We will see how e-invoice is generated, who are all required to generate an e-invoice, step-by-step process with illustration how to generate an e-invoice, whether a new schema has been announced or not, what are the importance and advantages of e-invoicing. We will also see the difficulties faced, how they have been overcome and also the clarifications issued with reference to e-invoicing. Before we begin this session, there are three very important myths that are required to be demystified as far as e-invoicing is concerned. It is generally believed that e-invoicing is to be generated from the common portal, which is not. Invoice has to be generated as usual by the taxpayers in their legacy ERP system, and certain data which are required will have to be submitted to the e-invoicing portal and get the invoice validated. Second myth that is associated with e-invoicing is that a new format has been notified for generating e-invoice, which again is not correct. There is no new format that has been notified with reference to this. The existing format can be used. Third myth associated is that e-invoicing is for all taxpayers and for all business transactions, which is also not correct. E-invoice is required only by specified class of persons and only for specified types of transactions, not for all types of transactions. Just like eBill, which is used to capture the data with reference to movements of goods whose consignment value is more than 50,000 rupees, e-invoice captures all the information with reference to taxable supplies, with reference to goods and with reference to services. There are 10 dedicated portals that has been created exclusively for the purpose of generating e-invoice, and the details of the portal are available in the public domain. Before we begin the session, two very important acronyms will have to be understood. One is IRP, Invoice Registration Portal, where every taxpayer will have to submit the data with reference to tax invoice and obtain IRN, which is Invoice Reference Number, which will validate the taxable supplies under GST, and both buyers as well as suppliers will be able to validate the information with reference to such taxable transactions. Based on the recommendations made by the 35th and 37th GST Council meetings, three very important sub-rules were inserted to Rule 48. The impacting section as far as this process is concerned is Section 31, which deals about tax invoice, debit notes and credit notes. The three important sub-rules inserted as part of Rule 48 are Sub-Rule 4 of Rule 48, which notifies the class of persons who are required to generate e-invoice. It speaks about the requirement only for registered persons. The taxpayers will have to generate a tax invoice in terms of Section 31, submit the information in the Invoice Registration Portal IRP and obtain Invoice Registration Number. This is in terms of Sub-Rule 4 of Rule 48. Sub-Rule 5 of Rule 48 mandates that if a person is required to generate an e-invoice and if he fails to generate an e-invoice, the self-assessment made by the taxpayer will not be treated as valid and the recipient of supply will not be able to take the input tax credit based on such invoices. Sub-Rule 6 of Rule 48 gives a facility that once the e-invoice is generated, there is no requirement for generating duplicate or triplicate copies of e-invoice. The next question that requires to be answered is, who is mandated to issue an e-invoice? Any registered taxpayer whose annual aggregate turnover in any of the preceding financial years has exceeded 5 crore rupees, he will have to generate an e-invoice. This e-invoice generation is specific for certain taxable transactions, that is from one registered person to another registered person. If the transaction is between one registered person and to an unregistered person, e-invoice is not required to be generated. E-invoice is also not required to be generated with reference to certain exceptions that are provided as part of the law. SEZ units, free trade warehousing zones and Business entities who are engaged in banking, financial, insurance and non-banking financial companies, business entities engaged in transportation of goods by road, passenger transport services, sale of movie tickets are not required to generate e-invoice, but supplies made to exports or to SEZ requires generation of e-invoice. What are the types of documents for which e-invoice is required to be generated? Three very important assessment documents as recognized under section 31 are required for generation of e-invoice. One is the tax invoice, the second is the debit note and the third one is the credit note. It is also mandated any other document as may be prescribed under section 31 will have to carry this e-invoicing process. There are 5 methods by which e-invoice can be generated. One is by offline utility tool that is provided by the portal. Second is the convenience of GST Suvidha providers can be used. Third is by direct API integration with the legacy accounting software. Fourth is if a taxpayer has got EBill credentials, that credential can be used for generating API. The taxpayers can also generate e-invoice through online filing also. Apart from the 5 functionalities that were mentioned earlier, one more new functionality for generating e-invoice has been made available, which is called GST e-invoice preparing and printing tool. This tool facilitates data to be submitted in a compatible file format that the invoice registration portal is able to accept. The invoice registration portal generates an invoice reference number and then returns it back to this tool, which can be downloaded, and the invoice reference number can be printed in each and every tax invoice. This facility has been created with an intention to make this entire process as easy as possible. What are the changes that the stakeholders will have to do with reference to e-invoicing? First of all, they should identify all those transactions which attract e-invoicing mechanism. They will have to update the masters with reference to their vendors as well as with reference to their customers. They should integrate their legacy ERP system compatible to the government portal so that the invoice registration number is generated by the portal seamlessly. They should also flag all those vendors to whom e-invoicing is not applicable, and they should take care that whenever they file their GST returns, those transactions which does not attract e-invoicing mechanism, like transactions from the registered person to an unregistered person, which will not be auto-populated in their returns, will have to be manually filed. Some more very important points that is required to be noted is that e-invoice is not applicable for input service distributor. So any taxpayer who has registered himself as an input service distributor for the purpose of distributing input tax credit, he is not required to generate e-invoice. Any taxpayer who is liable to pay tax under reverse charge mechanism, the liability or the responsibility for generating e-invoice is on the supplier and not on the recipient of supply, though the recipient of supply is liable to pay tax. E-invoicing is applicable only for notified class of persons, and other persons will not be able to generate e-invoice because in the portal they will not be enabled for generating e-invoice. E-commerce operators can generate e-invoice on behalf of their sellers and suppliers. Once e-invoice is generated and invoice reference number is notified, along with that a QR code will also be generated, which can be embedded in the tax invoice after downloading the information from the GST portal. The QR code will have important information like the GSTN number of the supplier, GSTN number of the recipient, the tax invoice number, date, tax invoice reference number, the value of the transaction, the tax details, the description along with the harmonized system of nomenclature code or the services accounting code in case of supply of services, and also it will contain the 64-digit invoice reference number with the date of generation. Once the invoice reference number is generated, it may not be possible for the taxpayer to cancel the e-invoice beyond 24 hours. The changes will have to be carried only while filing the statement of outward supply, which is called the GSTR1, at the time of filing the return. Second is, there is no duplication of invoices. If an invoice is attached with an invoice reference number, the same invoice number cannot be used for generating another invoice reference number. There is also no question of partial cancellation of e-invoice. For instance, if there are two supplies made in a single tax invoice, one supply is fructified, the other supply requires to be cancelled, e-invoice cannot be cancelled partially, the entire tax invoice will have to be cancelled and a new and fresh tax invoice will have to be generated for that supply which has fructified, and the e-invoice should be cancelled in toto, and for that invoice which has fructified, a fresh invoice reference number will have to be generated. As it was told earlier, the new tax invoice will have to carry a new tax invoice number and the earlier number cannot be used for the new tax invoice. E-Bill is a document which is generated at the time of transportation of goods. Just because e-Bill has been generated, it does not mean that e-invoicing is not required, because e-invoicing is required for all taxable supply of goods and services. Once e-invoice is generated, it auto-populates the statement of outward supply called GSTR1 of the supplier, and also it auto-populates GSTR2B return, which is an auto-drafted information of all the purchases made by the recipient of supply. There are two parts as far as e-Bill is concerned, Part A and Part B. Part A contains information about all the supplies that are made, right from the information with reference to the supplier's GSTIN, the place of supply, the description of the goods, the value of supply, and all other information required for assessment of tax liabilities. Part B contains only one information, that is the transport vehicle's registration number. So if the option for auto-populating Part A of the e-Bill is enabled at the time of generating e-invoice, the only information that is required for generating e-Bill is Part B information, which is the transportation vehicle's registration number, which can be manually entered. So in that situation, the e-Bill and the e-invoicing portal can be interplayed and data fed in one login credential can be used for generating the other document. E-invoicing being a very comfortable process which gives a sovereign mandate and validation for taxable transactions. The one question that arises in the taxpayer's mind is whether e-invoicing is voluntary process or whether it has to be done only by the notified class of persons. The answer to this is it can be done only by notified class of persons and for notified class of transactions only. It is not voluntarily enabled on only those taxpayers whose annual aggregate turnover in any of the preceding financial years is more than 5 crore rupees will be enabled by the portal for generating e-invoice, and it will be done only for notified class of transactions, that is transaction from a registered person to another registered person. All other transactions will not be enabled for e-invoicing, and therefore e-invoicing is not a voluntary process. It has to be done only by notified class of persons for notified class of transactions. The next doubt that arises in the taxpayer's mind is whether it is required to generate tax invoice in the e-invoice portal, that is invoice registration portal. The answer to that is it is not required to be generated from the e-Invoice portal, the tax invoice can be generated through the normal legacy ERP system in the manner that is normally generated, and certain information that are associated with e-invoice are required to be fed into the invoice registration portal, and invoice reference number will have to be obtained. So there is no requirement to generate the tax invoice per se straight away from the e-invoice portal. When an e-invoice for which the IRN number is generated is cancelled, will the e-way bill be automatically cancelled, because there is a facility for auto generation of e-way bill once e-invoice is generated? The answer is no. Both are independent, and if e-invoice is cancelled, the e-way bill will have to be cancelled separately. It will not be automatically cancelled. Second is, if the e-way bill is verified in transit by the tax officer, e-way bill cannot be cancelled even if e-invoice is cancelled. The next doubt is whether there is any linkage between credit note and debit note with reference to the original invoice at the time of validation of the e-invoice generation. The answer to this is there is no linkage at present with reference to the credit note or debit note with the original invoice. The credit note or debit note can be issued in a consolidated manner covering any of the preceding financial years with reference to any number of tax invoices that was generated earlier. The invoice reference number with reference to the e-invoice will validate only the credit note or debit note that is issued at present. Finally, let me wrap up the salient features with reference to e-invoicing. E-invoicing carries a unique invoice reference number after passing the deduplication test, and there cannot be two IRNs, invoice reference numbers, for the same tax invoice. Invoice reference number is digitally signed and carries a sovereign evidence. Third is, e-invoice carries a QR code which can be scanned at any point of time to take very important and critical information with reference to the supplier's GSTN number, the recipient's GSTN number, the description of the product, its HSN number or SAC code, the place from where it is supplied, and to the place where it is destined. It also is facilitated by the availability of multiple URLs for generating invoice reference numbers. Also, there is a standardized format for e-invoicing. There is no requirement for printing of e-invoices. There are multiple modes by which e-invoice can be generated, and the facilities for cancellation and amendment of e-invoice has also been made very easy on the portal. With this, I hope the viewers would have understood the process of e-invoicing, the objectives, who will have to generate e-invoice, what are the facilities available in e-invoice, and also what are the advantages that are associated in generating an e-invoice. Thank you very much.